Hi, everyone. My name's Beth Gleaney. I'm the Director of Parent and Family Engagement here at Include NYC for school-age kids. I'm here this evening to talk to you about what to do when challenging behavior happens in your home. Just to give you a little background on me, I've been working in the field of special education for the past 14 years. I've been a classroom teacher. I'm also a board certified behavior analyst and a licensed behavior analyst in the state of New York. So since Robert already went through sort of what we do, I'm gonna move us along. So tonight what we're gonna be working on is talking about specifically what to do when your children are having challenging behavior at home. So at the end of this workshop, we have two objectives. The first is that you'll be able to identify one communication strategy to use when challenging behavior occurs and one nonverbal strategy to use when challenging behavior occurs. So our agenda for the evening, we're going to start with a brief review of challenging behavior. Then we're going to review proactive strategies to manage behavior very quickly. I spoke about that last week. And then we'll talk about what to do when challenging behaviors happen. We'll talk about some specific behavioral concerns and then have a little bit of time at the end to take some questions. So when we talk about challenging behavior, I'm going to go over this very, very quickly so we have enough time to spend on what to do when challenging behavior happens. So when we talk about what is challenging behavior, it's any behavior that occurs at higher or lower rates than typical and interferes with the person's learning, engagement, or access. So things that might happen at higher rate might be things like hitting, screaming, running away. Lower rate might be work completion, responding to others, completing chores, making your bed, things like that. So that's what we're talking about when we're talking about challenging behavior. Other things that could be considered challenging behavior might be tantrum behavior or anything like that. So when we talk about behavior, it's important to remember that there are 4 functions of behavior. So behavior can be maintained or have the function of either attention, tangible, automatic, or escape avoid. So when we talk about attention, that means that the child is engaging in the challenging behavior to access attention. So the fact that they're getting attention makes them more likely to engage in that challenging behavior again. Tangible would be to access an item or an activity. So the child is engaging in challenging behavior so that they get given some sort of item. Sometimes it might be a preferred item. It might be an activity, getting to move to a different location or something like that. Automatically maintained challenging behavior is challenging behavior that something about it feels good or is meaningful for the child. So this is often thought about in terms of kids who engage in stereotypic behavior. So kids who may talk to themselves, they may sing, those kinds of things where it doesn't seem like it's really clear why they're doing it. It might be an automatic function. And then the last one is this idea of escape or avoid. So the child does not want to engage in the task and they're looking for a way out. So I know I went over that very, very quickly. I did have a webinar last week where I spoke about that in a little bit more depth. So today what we're really going to talk about is challenging behavior and what to do when it happens at home. So I'm going to start with talking a little bit about some proactive strategies to manage challenging behavior at home. So this is just a brief recap of what we talked about last week, because it's important to remember that when we're thinking about challenging behavior, the more proactive you can be, the better, right? So when we think about proactive strategies, we want to think about using routines, we want to think about using schedules, choice, having clear rules and expectations, as well as providing reinforcement. So when I talk about those things, what I mean by routines are that we have set activities or set schedules that we do during the day. So maybe you have a bedtime routine, a mealtime routine, or something like that. When we talk about schedules, we're talking about having a daily schedule or something of that nature for your student. And so if you want to know more about this, this was a webinar that we talked about last week. So feel free to check that out as well. Okay. So now what we're talking about tonight is what to do when challenging behavior specifically happens. So we're going to talk about it in two different ways. We're going to talk about first some general strategies to apply to any kind of challenging behavior, and then we're going to talk more specifically about specific types of challenging behavior and what are some recommendations that you could use around those specific kinds of challenging behavior. So when we talk about what to do when challenging behavior happens, the first thing I want to think about, and the first thing I want you to think about, is your verbal communication strategy. And so we're going to talk about 3 specific verbal communication strategies. We're going to talk about highlighting the positive. We're going to talk about using redirection and using time-based strategies. So when we talk about highlighting the positive, what I mean by that is I want you to think about stating what you want to see from your child. So rather than saying no running, you say something like, in this house, we use walking feet. Rather than saying don't scream, you say something like use a quiet voice. And so what you're doing is you're allowing your child to identify the behavior that you want to see more of. You want to see more of the walking feet. You want to see more of the quiet voice. And so what it does is it reduces the attention for challenging or unsafe behavior. And we know that attention may be something that can increase challenging behavior. So we want to try to keep the attention minimal. And you can also highlight what's being done right rather than calling out the inappropriate behavior. So what that might look like in your house is that, let's say you are sitting at dinner with your child and you serve something for dinner that your child doesn't want to eat, and your child starts to get upset and they start to scream, right? Rather than saying, hey, Billy, stop screaming, you might say something like, hey, Billy, remember when we're at the dinner table, we use a quiet voice. Or you might find something else that Billy's doing that is appropriate. Billy, I love the way you're cutting your food with a knife tonight. Billy, I love the way that you're sitting so nicely in your chair. And so what you're doing is you're highlighting the thing that's done well, that's being done right, rather than calling out the inappropriate behavior. So that's one thing to think about as a strategy when challenging behavior starts to happen. So the next thing to think about, oh, I forgot, we were going to try it. So I'll try this. So we're going to try to reframe these sentences. So rather than saying don't climb, you might say something like keep your feet on the floor. Rather than saying something like don't swear at each other, you might say something like use kind words, use nice language, something like that. Rather than saying no hitting, you might say something like keep your hands to yourself, keep your hands in your pockets, something like that. Rather than saying you have to stop running, you might say we walk, or we use slow feet, we use walking feet, anything like that. So thinking about really highlighting what's the behavior that you want to see rather than calling out the behavior that you don't want to see. The next communication technique we're going to talk a little bit about this evening is this idea of redirection. So when we talk about redirection, this is very similar to highlighting the positive. So when your child starts to do inappropriate behavior, challenging behavior, you're going to remind them of the right thing to do, right? So I hear some language that isn't the kind of language we use in this house. Let's try to use some nice words at home. Oh, that's a great looking toy. I love that you're playing with it. Can you put it back on the shelf for me? So the idea here is that we want to remind our child of the right thing to do and then try to redirect their behavior, redirect their energy to the more appropriate behavior that we want to see. So you might, this is often used if your child is refusing to sit or something like that. You might pair it with a gesture. So you point to the shelf if they're putting a toy away. You might point to the seat if you want them to take a seat in a chair. And then you're going to provide some praise when your child listens, right? So it's very similar to highlighting the positive, but the difference here is that we're really trying to get our child to move on to another activity or do the right thing, right? This is something that I often use. I have a toddler at home. I have a 2-year-old. And so this is something that I often use where he will be doing something that's not quite what he should be doing. And so reminding him of what he should be doing instead and trying to redirect him from the inappropriate behavior to a more appropriate behavior. The one thing to remember with redirection The most important part is that when your child starts to do the right thing, you want to provide some praise and make sure that they know that they are now doing the right thing, that they're doing what they want, that their behavior is what you want to see. And that can really help to sort of shift things if things are going in a direction of looking really challenging, that sometimes you can redirect and get your child back on the right track. Other things you want to think about in terms of challenging behavior, and again, these are general strategies that you could apply to any kind of challenging behavior. You might want to try and think about some time-based strategies, right? So things that might be helpful, trying some first then messaging. So first this, then that, right? So if your child is having trouble because they don't want to brush their teeth, it can be helpful to remind them, first brush teeth, then we move on with our day. First brush teeth, then we go get ready for bed, right? Just to remind them of what's happening next. Sometimes when kids are having challenging behavior, they can be experiencing a lot of stress and a lot of upset around that. And so it can be helpful to kind of ground them a little and remind them where they are in their schedule, where they are in their routine. And so that first then strategy can sometimes help to get your child back on track. Other things to think about with time that can be helpful when students are having challenging behavior is to think about using timers. And so what I mean by that is that if you know that for your child in particular, when we have to stop playing with Legos and clean up, they get really upset. And that's a really tough time for your child. You might want to think about using a timer with them beforehand, right? And so you might think about saying, okay, Jane, you have 3 more minutes with your Legos. I'm going to set a timer, right? And so that can help to give your child some warning cues about the fact that they're going to be transitioning. It can also help them to sort of regulate a little bit more. So that's something you can try. Other things to think about when your child is experiencing some challenging behavior, you want to think about what is available, what's happening, rather than talking about what is not available. So this is something that I use and have used a lot, both with my own small child and in my teaching career, is that I would often have students who would get really upset, or I would see children who get really upset because there's something that they want and that thing is not available. They really wanted to eat cookies for lunch. They really wanted to go to the park and it's raining. So rather than spending a lot of time talking about we don't eat cookies for lunch or it's raining, we're not going to go to the park, talk about what is available, talk about what's happening, right? So in that cookie example, it might be talking about, well, today for lunch, we're going to have a peanut butter and jelly sandwich and some potato chips and an apple. And it's going to be great. And that's what we're going to do. And it's really exciting, right? Rather than talking about what's not available, you can sometimes subtly redirect behavior because the child hears about what is available, what is going to be happening. And that may be enough to help them get back on the right track again. Other things to think about in terms of time are setting limits. So again, with that idea that transition can be hard and can sometimes result in some challenging behavior for students, setting limits around how long things are going to happen can be really helpful for your student. If your child is starting to have some challenging behavior, it can also be really helpful to sometimes offer them some choices, right? To say, it seems like you're getting really upset that we are not going to the park today. I know that's really upsetting and I hear you and I understand that you're really upset about it. Since we can't go to the park, do you want to read a book with mom or do you want to color, right? Give your child some autonomy, give your child some options, and that can sometimes help to make them de-escalate and start to move out of being upset and to help get your child back on track. Now, the one caveat I would say with choice making, especially when your child is already starting to get upset or starting to have some challenging behavior, is that we want to make sure that when we are offering options, we're offering things that are truly available and that we're not offering too many things. We don't want to offer an open-ended question because then you may end up in a situation where your child is already upset you have tried to talk with them and you guys have reached a point where you can make a choice about what they want to do next. And you offer, what do you want to do? And your child asks for something that's not available. And then you're sort of back at the beginning again, right? So we want to think about making that really structured, things that are truly available at that point in time. The other thing to think about with time that can be really helpful, and again, you can use your timers for this if you'd like. You can use the timer on your phone. You can use a kitchen timer. Is offering space or time to cool off. That's something that I found is very effective, especially for older children, saying, you seem like you're really upset right now. I'm going to give you a few minutes to cool off, and then I'll come back in 2 minutes, 5 minutes, figure out what works best for your child and for your family. And I'm going to come back in a few minutes to check in, see how you're doing, and we can talk about what's happening next. So really offering some space, offering a little time to calm down, to cool off. Think about your own behavior. I know for myself, sometimes I'm really, really, really angry, and I don't want to talk to anyone about it at that point in time. And if I try to talk to someone about it at that point in time, it's just going to make it worse, right? And so I need to take a minute or two, cool off a little bit, calm down, and then I'm able to talk about what I'm upset about or the thing that's bothering me. And so thinking about that for your child can also be really helpful in terms of challenging behavior. Other things we want to think about with verbal communication: use I messages when communicating, right? So we want to talk about, I see that this is what's happening. I'm noticing that you seem upset, right? Rather than phrasing things as, you're mad, or what are you doing? We want to talk about using those I messages so that your child knows that you're listening, you're there, you're supporting, and you're saying what you see, what you observe, right? If your family has rules and expectations, which I would encourage you to have, refer to those, right? So you might want to just remind your child of what the rule is, what the expectation is. We don't want to get too hung up on that. Just maybe one, refer to it and move on. When your child has calmed back down, then we can talk a little bit more about the rules and the expectations. But when they're upset, maybe just a quick reminder can sometimes be really helpful. Other things to think about in terms of your verbal communication is I want you to think about being as clear and concise as you can. Thinking again about your own behavior when you're upset. I know for myself, sometimes when I'm upset, I'm not really hearing what people are saying, especially when there's a lot of words, right? It sort of goes in one ear and out the other. So what you want to think about here is being clear and concise. We know from the research that sometimes when children are upset, they're not able to process language as well as they can when they are not upset. So you want to give some time and some space, have really clear, concise, consistent messaging. This isn't the time for a lecture. This is the time for, let's get everything calmed down. Let's make sure everybody's okay. And then once everybody's calm, once everything is A-okay, then we can have a more detailed conversation around what happened. But right now we're just trying to get everybody calmed down, cooled off. And so that's why you want to be clear and concise with your language. Other things to think about is, we do also want to allow children time to express their emotions, right? So we're not saying that kids can't be angry or sad or mad or frustrated. They can, and they can have time to express that and tell you that they are upset. And we can model that for them, how to do that. So we do also want to allow some time, like that idea that we were just talking about with giving your child some time to cool off. And then this last tip for verbal communication is incredibly important. So when your child is upset and having some challenging behavior, we just want one adult at a time talking to them. Just one, right? It can get really confusing for your child If you are talking to them and then your spouse is talking to them, or you are talking to them and their aunt or an older sibling or a grandparent or a friend is talking to them, it can make them feel like they're getting ganged up on, which can make them feel more stressed out and result in more challenging behavior. It can also be confusing for them because you might be saying X, but the other adult might be saying Y. So you want to be really clear about who's the adult who's trying to de-escalate and calm things back down, right? So I always recommend one adult at a time. That doesn't mean that if you as the adult start to get frustrated or start to feel like what you're doing isn't working, you can ask for another adult to switch with you. So I do this quite often with my husband when I'm with my toddler, where, he might be really upset and he's having a tantrum because his car is not where he wants it to be, or whatever the reason might be, that it might reach a point where I say, hey, can you come hang out with him for a little bit? I need to take a deep breath and cool off. And so that's okay too. But we really want to think about just one adult at a time, because that idea of too many people talking is going to get confusing for your child. Other things we want to think about is we want to be aware of yourself. So you need to be aware of your own body, your own body language, your positioning, and we also want to give ourselves some grace and a little bit of space, which we'll talk a little bit about. So when we think about nonverbal communication, we need to remember that our child's behavior may be influenced by our body language, right? So our posture, our tone, the gestures that we're using, the amount of eye contact that we're giving our child, how close we are to them, that idea of proximity, those things can all really impact and really influence your child's body language, influence your child's challenging behavior, Again, think about your own experiences. If someone is talking to you and they look like they're really upset or really angry, you're going to feel that, and it's going to make you feel things, right? And so our children are the same way. So we want to be really mindful of our posture and our tone. And we'll talk a little bit about how to do that. So we're going to take a minute. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'd invite you to look at these 3 pictures and then comment in the chat. How do these people feel? How do you know how they feel, right? So if this woman who's screaming in the pink sweatshirt is telling you, I'm here to help you, I want to help you, do you think she actually wants to help you? This woman in the middle who's pointing a finger at you and telling you, I'm not mad, I'm not upset. Is she not mad? Is she not upset? Right? So thinking about how do these people feel and how do you know it? So I'm going to give us about 1 minute to comment in the chat. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we can do that. Yeah, so we know because of their facial expressions, we know because of their gestures, we know because they don't look like they're in control, they look upset, they look frustrated, right? All of these things we know because of what their body language is, right? So we want to be mindful of that with oops, I clicked the wrong button. Sorry, guys. So we want to be mindful of that with our children, right? And be mindful of our body language when we're working and when we're helping our children through challenging behavior. So some things I want you to think about in terms of your body language, things that can help to combat that. Stand to the side, not right in front of your child when they're starting to get upset. Now, the reason for that is that, again, thinking about your own experience, if someone is standing right in front of you, it can often feel really threatening, right? And so by standing a little bit to the side, it's slightly less threatening. And although your child may not see you as threatening, Sometimes just that person being directly in front of them when they're already agitated and already stressed out can make your child feel more stressed out. Other things we want to think about is being aware of our eye contact and keeping our face neutral. So the reason for that is that we can provide some attention that we may not want to provide, because like we talked about earlier, behavior can be maintained or occur because your child is looking for attention. So we want to be aware of both of those things. And the other thing to remember here is that sometimes the things that our children do as challenging behavior, while they are challenging, they also can be funny and they can be humorous. So we want to be aware and keep our face neutral so that we don't inadvertently laugh or smile or giggle, because that can cause the behavior to continue to happen, because your child may not understand that I shouldn't be throwing my peas on the floor, right? And yelling that it's a pea parade and throwing green peas on the floor. We don't want them to do that. That's challenging behavior. That's inappropriate. That's not what we want them to do with their food. But it's also funny. And so if I start to laugh, my child might do that more because they think, Mom thinks this is funny. I'm going to do more of this. Now I'm going to start throwing carrots, right? So be really aware of keeping your face neutral and watching your eye contact, especially for situations where the behavior may be a little bit funny. Other things we want to be aware of are our arm positioning, like you saw in those 3 pictures, right? The finger in the face looks like you're really mad. It can look really intimidating. Your arms are folded and crossed over your chest. So just be aware of where your arms are. And then that last thing to be aware of is your proximity. How close are you? How far away are you? If you're in really, really close, sometimes that can make things escalate a little bit faster. You may want to give your child some space if you have space. But so think about that idea of proximity. And again, that's something that you'll need to think about for your child as an individual. If you have multiple children, it may be different for each of your children. Your older child may need and may be okay with a different level of proximity than your younger child. So just something to sort of play around with. Other things to remember in here, especially with these body language strategies, if there are things that you find work really well at home when your child is upset or when your child is agitated, that's great information to share with their teachers and with their school staff. That can be really helpful and really great information to share. So the last thing I want to talk about in here is this idea of grace and space. And so what I mean by that is when your child has challenging behavior, it can be stressful for the caregiver, so that's you, and also for your child. So give yourself some grace, give yourself a little space, as long as it's safe. Take a deep breath, stay calm. If you need help, see if there's someone you can ask. If you're starting to get frustrated, if you're starting to get really stressed out, ask if someone can help you. So just be aware that yes, this is stressful for your child. It's also stressful for you. And take a deep breath, count to 5, stay calm, keep everybody safe, but just give yourself some grace and some space there, and be aware that this can be a stressful situation for everyone involved. So sort of these general strategies that we've talked about, sort of some overall general strategies that we want to think about, right? So this applies to any kind of challenging behavior. We're going to want to make environmental changes to keep everyone safe. So that might mean moving things out of the way. That might mean moving your child to a different location, whatever that might look like. But we're going to want to make some environmental changes to keep everyone safe. Think about, are there things you can do to make that behavior irrelevant? Are there things you can do to manipulate the environment or the schedule so that behavior doesn't need to happen anymore? Think about those proactive strategies that we talked about. So think about schedules, think about routine, Think about offering choices, setting limits. What proactive things can you do to avoid getting into situations where challenging behavior is happening? So ideally, what we want to see, more proactive strategies across the day may result in less instances of significant challenging behavior. Other things to think about, if you know that there is something that typically works as a strategy to help calm your child down, think about, can you try that in a different environment? Can you try that in a different context? Expand upon what you know. You are the expert on your child. And so you know what are the things that are helpful and what are the things that help to calm your child down when they're experiencing challenging behavior. So try that in different environments. Try to sort of make changes to it and see if it still works in the same way, right? But expand on what you know. Expand on what you know works for your child. Other things to think about are, if you know that there is something that is often a trigger for your child, what we in the behavior world sometimes call the antecedent, see if there are things that you can do to reduce or eliminate that, right? So if you know that transitions are really difficult for your child, are there ways that you can make transition feel less scary for your child? Maybe that means using timers, maybe that means using a schedule, maybe that means offering more choice around transition times, right? So if you know there are things that are hard for your child, think about what are the things you can do to reduce those things that are hard or eliminate them if possible. And then other things just to remember, so you're going to want to be mindful of your own body language. You're going to want to stay calm, take a breath, and that idea of one adult talking at a time. So those are sort of the general things that I want you to be aware of for all kinds of challenging behavior. And now we're going to talk a little bit more specifically about some more specific behavioral concerns. So the first thing to mention here is safety. Safety is the most important thing. You need to keep yourself safe. You need to keep your child safe. You need to keep the other people in your home safe. So safety trumps all of this, right? If you're thinking, I should try this strategy, but it doesn't feel like it would be safe to do right now, don't try it, right? So the most important thing is keeping everyone safe in any situation where there's challenging behavior. So when we talk about challenging behavior, you may have a child who has off-task behavior. So children who you ask them to do something, they don't start doing it, or this might look like refusal to work. This might look like refusal to do chores. This might look like those kinds of things. So what I want you to think about here, sort of some proactive strategies that you can try. You can think about scheduling with your child. So setting up a daily schedule, offering scheduled breaks. This might be a good situation to try using timers. This might be a good time to try using first then type strategies. You might want to offer some breaks to your child as needed, or consider teaching your child how to ask for breaks. And that's specifically if your child has off-task behavior or has difficulty completing tasks. So you want to think about some proactive things that you can do. In the moment, the things that I would recommend are really that idea of first then strategies. I would recommend referring back to any schedules or systems that you have in place, but this is really the kind of behavior that you're going to want to be proactive and plan for to see if you can really reduce or eliminate that off-task behavior. So you may have a child who engages in tantrum behavior. Tantrum behavior looks different for different kids based on their age. Tantrum behavior can be really stressful for the parent or the caregiver, so you're going to want to stay calm. If it's safe, allow your child to express their emotion. This is a time where you might want to consider setting timers or giving your child a break. This is, again, something where it might be helpful to consider using schedules. When your child is actively having tantrum behavior, what I don't want you to do, and sort of my biggest recommendation, for tantrum behavior, as well as for any kind of challenging behavior, is I don't want you to think about changing what you've already set up, right? If you have said to your child that we're not going to the park today because it's raining, and your child starts to throw a tantrum, and then you say, okay, fine, we can go to the park, what you're inadvertently doing is teaching your child that if my parent or my caregiver says that we can't do something and I really want to do it, if I throw a tantrum, the answer might change, right? So we want to keep whatever we've set out the same when the child is having a tantrum. And then when your child is calm, depending on your child's age, you can talk about, what is a different way that they could have approached the situation, and what is a different solution maybe for the thing that upset them. Now, the other thing to note here is that if your child has tantrums that are very severe or very intense, and you are concerned about them, which I totally understand, I would recommend that you speak with your child's school or your child's pediatrician about your child about your concerns about their behavior, and talk to them about what are your options. Are there options for more intensive behavioral planning or behavioral programming? If you need help with how to have that conversation, or you have questions about who to talk to at your child's school or at your child's preschool, the family educators on our helpline, and the helpline information is in these PowerPoint slides, can also help you with process support. And so they can help you to figure out who's the person to talk to, or who would be best to hear your questions. I typically recommend starting with your child's teacher, but again, if you have questions about that, our family educators on the helpline can help with that. So if your child has destructive behavior, we're going to talk a little bit about what are some things that you can do here. So when your child is having destructive behavior, again, the first thing I want you to think about is keeping everyone safe, right? So safety is, of course, the number one thing. We want to keep everyone safe. So when your child is starting to engage in destructive behavior, the first thing I recommend trying that strategy of redirection. Try to redirect them back to a more appropriate activity, right? So tell them something else that they could be doing, provide another option, and again, use those gestures, things like that. Try to remove any items that can be destroyed or thrown. So try to eliminate the ability for them to engage in destructive behavior. But some sort of proactive strategies to think about if you know that your child sometimes gets really upset and has destructive behavior. I want you to think about pre-framing your expectations before you start an activity that has materials that could be destroyed or thrown or displaced, right? So that might look like if your child is playing with blocks, you give them a reminder before they start playing with blocks about, when we play with blocks, we stack them and we can build a tower, we can build a tunnel, can build all these cool things. But remember, our blocks stay on the table or stay on the floor or wherever your child is doing blocks, and we don't throw them. But I'm so excited to see what you make. I'm so excited to see what you create. So you're going to set up really clear expectations before starting the activity to let your child know what you expect to see when they're working with that item. The other thing to think about is setting really clear limits. Again, very similar to expectations, but again, you want to set clear limits about what you're willing to see. So thinking about maybe for an art activity, you might tell your child you're going to paint. When you paint, it's only on paper. If you paint off of your paper, I'm going to give you one warning, and if you do it again, painting is going to be finished for today, right? So we're setting clear limits and also an expectation, but saying, if I see that you're starting to use the materials in a way that's not appropriate, the materials will be finished. Again, if your child is having episodes of destructive behavior and you are concerned about the level or the intensity or the frequency, I would again encourage you to speak with your child's school or your child's pediatrician. And again, you can call our helpline to get some process support around that. So the last behavior I want to talk a little bit about is aggression. And so aggression is something that is always very concerning when it's happening. Again, we want to make sure that we're keeping kids safe, keeping everyone in your home safe. So the things you want to think about here, as a proactive strategy, you want to think about pre-framing your expectations. You want to think about talking to your child about how to manage their feelings. You might want to consider doing some pre-teaching. The other thing with aggression and also with destruction as well, make it clear not when your child is agitated, but when everybody's calm and safe, that aggression and destruction are not okay. They're not acceptable behaviors. And what are things that they should do instead when they feel that way, right? They could ask to take a break. They could ask to do something else. What are the strategies that you can use? But again, if we know that our child sometimes has aggressive behavior, thinking about if we know that there are specific situations or that sharing can be hard or something like that, pre-framing what it's going to look like when they are engaging in that kind of activity, what sharing could look like, thinking about pre-teaching, asking them what they want to do differently if they've had episodes previously. So thinking about those proactive strategies. And then again, those de-escalation techniques like we talked about before, with thinking about your communication, thinking about your nonverbal communication, with only one adult talking, all of those kinds of things can help in those situations. And again, like for destruction and for tantrum and for any behavioral concern, really, if you have concerns about the level, the frequency, the intensity, you would want to speak with your child's school, your child's preschool, or your child's pediatrician about more intensive support. And you can call our helpline, and we have folks who can help you talk through what that might look like. So the big things I want you to be aware of, sort of my top 5 tips for managing challenging behavior at home. I want you to use proactive strategies. So again, those ideas that we talked about earlier, talking about pre-framing what's expected, having clear rules and expectations, identifying and praising the appropriate behaviors that you want to see, and setting clear limits. I would prefer that you spend more time thinking about your proactive strategies and build robust proactive strategies that you're trying, so that way your child is in an environment where there are a bunch of proactive things we're doing to prevent challenging behavior from happening entirely. Once the challenging behavior is starting to happen, the amount of things that we can do and the amount of strategies that we can use really sort of reduces because of how stressed out your child will feel, how stressed out you feel. So we want to think more about those proactive strategies rather than reactive strategies. When challenging behavior is happening, we want to be mindful of our body language and our nonverbal communication. Again, we want to make sure that we keep everybody safe in no matter what the situation is. One adult talking at a time as much as possible. You want to give your child words and allow them to express themselves in whatever way they do, whether that's they use an iPad, whether they use a PEX board, whether they're verbal, but give them some time to express themselves, especially once they've calmed back down to talk about how they were feeling and what they were thinking. That can really help. And then the last one is to play with them. A lot of this challenging behavior, to think about, we want our time with our kids to be fun. And if children are engaged in activities that are fun and meaningful, and they are playing and having a good time, we sometimes see less challenging behavior. So that's another thing to be sort of thinking about in the back of your head. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can answer some questions. So I'll take a peek at your questions in the Q&A box.
I'm also going to be sharing some resource links in the chat box for those who are looking.
So I'm going to start with this first question. So she asked, what does one do with a child who runs back and forth, maybe with a sensory difficulty, and cannot be redirected. So I would say that if you're finding that your child is having sensory difficulties, or if you're having trouble redirecting your child, I would think about talking to your child's school or your child's pediatrician. Your child may need more behavioral treatment or more behavioral support. Other things I would think about if you feel like that's something that's happening, is you could also think about scheduling in breaks, sensory breaks during your day. If you know that your child gets to a point where they need to run around a little bit, you could think about planning and scheduling that in their day to offer some pre-planned, as a proactive strategy, some scheduled time in the day where they have the opportunity to run or to do jumping jacks or something like that. So I hope that answers your question. I hope that's somewhat helpful. So there's a question after one adult speaks to a child, should another adult come behind the first one and basically say the same thing? You want both adults to be giving similar messages, right? So you don't want it to be one adult says, we can't go to the park, we can't go anywhere, and then the other adult comes in and says, you look like you're upset. Here's a sleeve of cookies and a Coke. Do you feel better now? Let's go to the park, right? Because that's going to be really confusing. So you want both adults to have similar messages, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the second adult needs to parrot exactly what the first adult said. So I think it's sort of a fine line, but you want to make sure that if you are, as a parent, saying to another adult, maybe an aunt or another parent or a friend, that, I need a break, that you're conveying what are the things that you've already set as limits, because we want to make sure that those things don't change with a new adult. But sometimes just seeing a fresh face can help, and can be helpful for the child and also for the adult who is working with the child as well. So the next question is, are these techniques good for children who are on the spectrum? What do you do if they are stuck to a specific routine or they're not good with change? So yes, these techniques would work with children who are on the spectrum. I've worked with children who are on the spectrum for a long time. So yes, they would work. And if you have a child who's stuck in a specific routine or not good with changes, some things that I've done are to do programmed changes or program schedule shifts. And so that might look like making it into something where they have a schedule and we tell them that today we're going to do, X, Y, and Z. And one of the things is an adventure, right? And that might be taking that different route to the appointment. And so thinking about what are the things that you can do to sort of proactively let your child know that the routine is going to be a little bit different, or build some flexibility into the routine. I would also recommend talking to your child's teacher to see what are their strategies that they're using at school that you could do at home that also work for that specific routine piece. I know there are a lot of questions. I'm going to try to get through as many as I can. We have about 3 more minutes. So I'm going to try to get through them. So there's a question about a child who doesn't want to get up early for remote learning in class. So the things I would think about there for as some strategies, I would think about using proactive strategies. I would think about using routines. I would think about using reinforcement. I would also think about creating a schedule and trying some of those strategies to see if that helps with the getting up in the morning. The other thing, though, that I should mention is that if you feel like your child is having trouble waking up from sleep and you're concerned, I would also mention that to your child's pediatrician, not to be an alarmist. But anything that involves sleep, we want to make sure that we're just making sure there's no sort of medical issue going on underneath. So just something to sort of think about for your child. So the next question is, how about a child who does not pay much attention to remote learning and starts throwing a tantrum or throwing objects or crying? I think you mean that your child is having trouble during their remote learning and they're having tantrums during their remote learning time. So the things that I would think about I would think about schedules, and I would think about routines there. I would also think about maybe offering some scheduled breaks. I would think about setting some limits around that for the tantrums during the remote learning. Other things to think about are, is your child someone who would be interested in something novel, like doing their remote learning in a different chair or in a different room, as something special and different to try. I would also talk with my child's teacher and let the teacher know that your child is having tantrums during the remote learning, to see if there's something that the teacher recommends as well. So I hope that answers your question. It's hard for me to answer that without seeing it, but that again is something that I would think about talking to your child's school or your child's teacher about. It is just about 6 o'clock. I thank you all so much for coming. I'm so appreciative to have so many of you here with me. So thank you very much for coming. I'll be back on again next week on Monday night to talk about strategies and tips and tricks for getting your child to wear a mask. I thank you so much for attending. And like I said, please feel free to call our helpline with any questions. And we have folks there who'd be happy to help you. Thanks so much.